Hi, and welcome to Write More Light. My name is Sarah, coming to you from the Midwest Writing Center with something I'm going to work on is using that word less. Today we're going to be talking about creative nonfiction, which is has a special place in my heart as someone who lives in the space of creative nonfiction. And we're going to talk about why it's popular right now, what it means, how to make it yourself, the usual Write More Light format with special guest Kitty Carter. Hi, baby. Anyway, so the format tends to go, I will give a little lesson, we'll learn a little something together, and then I'll give updates from the Midwest Writing Center and then our free write. Free write tends to be within the same topic of the segment. And that's how we'll go. If you have watched before, you know that Carter can get in this room whether I want him to or not. So we like to make it a happy time with the cat. Okay, so what is creative nonfiction? Seems like a pretty straightforward question, or like it should have a pretty straightforward answer, but it is kind of whatever you want it to be. There are things that it is not that I think are easier to explore and explain than what it is. And that's okay. We're going to try. So first and foremost, creative nonfiction is nonfiction that is treated creatively from its inception. So when you sit down to write, we're being creative. That seems pretty straightforward, except that I would also make the argument that anytime writing is being done, it's a creative force. So that's where it gets complicated. What it is not. Again, I want to say for the record, I want there to be no question about it. Anytime you sit down to write, there's something creative happening. So what it is not. Journalism, textbooks, things that are inspired by real life. I would say those are probably fiction, more likely. And if they're under the title, under the umbrella of creative nonfiction, I think that's a little bit abusive of the term creative or nonfiction. If it's inspired by real events, what that means is you're getting inspiration from something that happened. You're not telling a true story. It's a muddy genre. And that's kind of the beauty of it. Some other things that creative nonfiction is not: science books, how-to books, self-help or self-transformation. Again, anytime something is written, it's a creative act. There is creation happening. There is forces of creativity, of imagination at play in the brain or the hand of the writer. But those don't fall under the creative nonfiction umbrella as a genre. So another thing is, you go to a bookstore, we'll say like any old large bookstore, and there's the possibility that you will see a poetry section, fiction section, right? And the fiction section may have some genres involved, right? There might be comics or manga, there might be sci-fi fantasy, there might be mysteries or thrillers, but those are still like all in the same fiction department, divided down into smaller sections, but still all under fiction. And the whole rest of the store is nonfiction. And what does that mean? Of course, sometimes like religion and philosophy are on their own, or self-help, self-transformation are on their own, cookbooks, right? But those are all also nonfiction, right? They are not fiction. They're not literature. Sometimes bookstores call fiction literature to sound cuter. I don't know. If it is not a novel or a short story or specifically a work of fiction, it's probably under the nonfiction umbrella. So figuring out where creative nonfiction falls within that place is what makes it slightly more complicated. I would say too that most things that we like reading are creative nonfiction. Now, if I go into, I knew I was going to do this. I specifically didn't grab a book about World War One because I didn't want to talk about World War One, but it's always World War One in my head. And we'll make that connection later and you'll know why. If I go into the bookstore and I go into the World War One section, which by the way is about this big in most bookstores, and World War II has like 12 shelves, which makes sense. It looms larger in our memories because it was a lot more dramatic. There's a lot going on. And I pick up a book on planes used in World War One. That's probably not creative nonfiction, but if I pick up this book that I specifically didn't grab, we're now in the time of year in which my bookshelves are fully disorganized because most of them live on my desk so that I can reference them for these videos. I've got this book. It's a book of literary criticism, but it's about World War One. It's called The Great War and Modern Memory. I would categorize that probably more as a textbook than a book of history or a book of creative nonfiction. But I think it would be really easy to make the argument that something that is literary criticism, which is how it's properly defined on the back of books, you can see what category they are to be shelved in. It's right above the barcode. If it's either right above the barcode or at the very top of the back of the book, if that interests you. And so that makes it kind of complicated, right? But if I go into the World War One section and I see A Movable Feast by Ernest Hemingway, well, it wouldn't be there probably. But that is a nonfiction book about the post-World War One era. But usually we see Hemingway in fiction, right? I should have grabbed that book. I don't rightly know what category where it's shelved. I might look that up while we're here. It gets complicated. And the reason for that, I think mostly is that like genres are too strict. But I've gotten way off track. Let's rewind a little bit. Let's go farther. Let's go further back in history. There's a fun little grammar note. Further denotes something intangible. Farther means physical distance. Now you know. Colloquially, meaning in everyday language, doesn't make a difference what you use. So let's go further back in history to the dawn of storytelling, right? Creative nonfiction has always existed as long as we've been telling stories. And that's in hyperbole, right? Like I'm telling you, I just escaped a bear attack. Maybe it was like a baby bear that was running at me. When we tell stories as human beings, we use hyperbole. It makes the story more interesting. Maybe we're insecure about, sorry about that sound. It makes the story more interesting or more engaging, maybe, or in our own heads it does. There's also like, maybe you don't remember everything, so you're filling in the blanks when you're doing oral storytelling. Mythology was trying to explain things that we don't understand with phenomena that we can see and quantify. Is mythology creative nonfiction? I would say so, in just the basest definition, right? It is trying to explain the natural world. Now, of course, if you go into a bookstore and you want to look up mythology, or a library, I don't know why. I was going to say, I don't know why libraries aren't the thing that I go with, but library sections are much more complicated and distilled really exactly, and is a really cool thing that I would think we should have an episode on how either the Dewey Decimal or Library of Congress organization systems work. That would be really cool. Anyway, if you go to look for mythology, it's going to probably be under like philosophy. If you've got a section on folklore, totally going to be there. But that's interesting, right? We're not putting it in fiction unless it's like a retelling of old stories. that's really cool, right? But it also, you've seen me, I had Emily Kingery on last year and we debated whether genre was real, which I don't think at the end of the day that it matters. But she was arguing for the delineation between poetry and prose. I was asking her define poetry and saying genre doesn't exist. Yeah. So part of the problem is the way we define genres. I think right now creative nonfiction is in vogue because we're in a time in art where the bounds of genre are kind of melting. I don't want to say they're being broken down. I feel like they're just sort of melting, like sloping slowly away. And we saw this a lot. You'll see this is where World War I comes in. We saw this a lot too, this blending of genres during modernism, which happened at the turn of the 20th century. I like to say in the 20s, but I think properly it started right at the end of the 19th century and ended right around the 2030s. Modernism is, I use some literary jargon, I'm going to try and define it as I go. Modernism is defined by the idea that things are not objective. So facts, certainty isn't real. Modernists played a lot with perception. Now that goes for the music of the time, the visual arts of the time, probably movies, which there were fewer of, but they did exist. Things started to get a little meta and self-referential, meta being self-referential. I'm noting that I'm making art inside the art that I'm making. It's like on TV when a character breaks the fourth wall. Deadpool is our fourth wall breaker in comics. Modernism also saw a rejection of tradition. At the time, the world's sort of physical genres were bending a lot. We were seeing the rise of industrialization industry. So cities were becoming much more what they look like today, rather than just more concentrated population and more, say, shopping. We were seeing more merging of what we would call like traditional life, right? Like I'm going about my life. Traditional life at the time was much different than it is today. People made their own clothes, they mended their own wounds, they made their own tools, they fixed the things they kept in their home. And then came industrialization, and we could buy things that we would ordinarily have to make ourselves. Things are a lot easier to use with electricity and plumbing changing. And we saw a lot of innovation in science. We saw a lot of innovation in war. We saw changes to commerce, for example, I can buy clothing instead of making it, which saves me a lot of time. And we also gained huge advances in travel. So people were not as confined to their physical space as they were before. People had been traveling by boat, which takes a lot longer than traveling by air. Anyway, so that's the last time we saw this level of genre blurring between fiction and nonfiction. I'm not even touching poetry today. We're going to pretend that all of this is specific to prose, which it's not. Not at all. But if you are trying to place poetry within fiction or nonfiction, you are going to have a headache. Okay. Whew. So there's a little bit of a history on creative nonfiction. But I think another thing that's happening, and this is something that I've done some research into myself, is that we're opening up a space right now for more genres or less rigidity within genres. We know that, say, children or young adults as genres only exist or primarily exist because of marketing. Historically, this is so funny, for whatever reason, To Kill a Mockingbird's just been on my desk this week. I don't remember pulling it out. I think it happened when I was organizing my books, but traditionally, literature was literature. It got published or it didn't. The way we define children's lit or young adult lit today is based on the age of the narrator or protagonist, which is fine. That's usually a good way to do it. That's usually how you know the age of the audience. But Scout in To Kill a Mockingbird has just started school. She's 6. And we wouldn't put this in. I love this book. That was clearly stolen from a school before I was born. Oh, not before I was born. I see the name in the back. We would never put this in children's lit. This is not children's lit, but that has been our barometer for how to define these things in recent years. So as we are adding genres, I guess, to our, I was going to say curriculum, that's absolutely not the word. But as we're adding genres, in a lot of ways, we're becoming more open-minded about what counts as literature or what sells, which, you know, is unfortunate. We should be able to read everything there is to read. That's just not how it works. Yeah. So as we're sort of opening our minds to what else can be written, what else can be read, what else can be sold, we're seeing openings. And that is where creative nonfiction comes in. 17 minutes to get to this point. I hope that little background was helpful. Now, things that fall under the category specifically that are established as creative nonfiction are things like essays or the lyric essay, epistolaries, that's generally letter writing, probably diary writing doesn't work so well because you're writing that for yourself, not for an audience. And I think probably, hopefully, most writing starts out existing for the self, but in the end, when you are transferring it to calling it literature or trying to publish it, a lot changes. So someone like me who writes letters, or someone who writes like open letters or even letters to the editor, that would be epistolary, where a diary entry, I think, would not enter into the realm of creative nonfiction just because it's not written for publication. Essays are a favorite of mine, but a lot of the time we get confused when we hear the word essay. We think about what we learned in school, like that 5-paragraph format, intro, body, conclusion, or we think about stuff that we see in textbooks, or we think just like any piece of nonfiction writing is an essay, and that's not the case. I would say a lot of essays that we see out in the world fall under this category, and we don't think of them that way, especially living the way we do with the internet. Things have changed quite a bit. I know I used to think of an essay and think of like what people write in college, and this is of course before college. I would probably just call that a paper at this point. But then we've got like listicles. I love me a listicle. We've got this like really short form news that we look into. And I would say if it's specifically news, I already said journalism doesn't really fall under this category, then I would keep it out. But if it's a listicle or a feature, I'd say like a feature news article tends to fall more into creative nonfiction. The rules of writing journalism change between news article and feature. I'm not going to get into that. Maybe I can have a journalist on some other time to talk about it. but not today. So I want to talk about, I'm going to do some side-by-side comparisons. I also want to talk about autofiction, which is a whole thing. It's very hot right now. I'm not super, I haven't read a lot of it. I'm not super educated on autofiction, but I will tell you briefly what it is. It's you are writing your own life story and fictionalizing it. So it's like an autobiography, but fictional. Let's start. Let's look at a creative memoir next to autofiction. I don't really know if autofiction should be under the category of creative nonfiction or under the category of fiction. I also feel that way when I'm reading autofiction, or sometimes we see, this isn't super common, but it does happen. Sometimes we see fiction in which the main character or the narrator's name is the same as the author's name. And I don't know if that's metafiction, autofiction, goofy writer syndrome. But you do see that sometimes. I'm thinking of Jonathan Safran Foer's first book, Everything is Illuminated. It distracted me. Jonathan, I've read everything else he's written, but I never finished that book, so it distracted me. The book I have as an example here is not that one, and I have not finished this book either, but I've read significantly more of it than I read of Everything is Illuminated. Homeland Elegies. It's called a novel here on the cover. I am not totally certain I'm going to pronounce Ahkad properly. That first name I don't know how to pronounce. But the main character, the narrator, is Ahkad, and it talks about very recent history, American, US history, and world history. And it goes through things that absolutely could be happening, absolutely happened to someone. And I think that it's called a novel because it sort of defies genre. And also, I think you can get in some trouble if you are fictionalizing anything. And I apologize. If you're fictionalizing anything and trying to call it nonfiction, that's obviously messy for legal reasons. And I think a lot of the time, historically, people have done that. People have called things fiction that were nonfiction. And now we want to create this new category for those things to find home, autofiction. I don't know. I don't know the answer to that legally or in publishing, but I think it's nice to give those things a home. I think it's nice to allow those stories to be told, especially because memories are so tricky and emotion plays so hard into memories. And there's just no documenting every fact of every moment. And stories still deserve to be told. Stories still happen. And it's nice to have a home for those things. That's the best definition I can give you of autofiction. It is a fictionalized autobiography. It's the best I can do. Probably you can do your own internet search and come up with a better definition and more examples of autofiction than the single one that I've just provided you. Now, I do have a memoir here, and I was going to try and keep all of these books that I'm referencing things I've never referenced before, but being me, I have a personal obligation to keep it local. So we all know, right, because everyone watching here has watched this show before or has attended the Collins Writers Conference. So we all know Chuy Renteria. He's been on the show. He was an instructor at the Collins Writers Conference, and Chuy is also just a crazy talented person. Excuse me, a super talented person. Chuy's memoir, we heard it when we were young, is very creatively written because Chuy is a talented writer. They go through things, and it's very clear that you're getting a single perspective. It's very clear that the writer is telling a story from the heart and not just recounting facts. And that, I think, is a big factor in what makes it creative versus just nonfiction. So I'm going to read just the first paragraph, because I don't want to, I'll read the whole book to you if I let myself. Prologue, we heard it when we were young by Chuy Renteria. By the time I noticed someone was talking to me, he had repeated himself a few times. His voice invaded my thoughts, like someone turning the dial on a radio until words creep up from the static. Hey, little Mexican. Hey, I'm talking to you, motherfucker, you little fucking Mexican. I apologize for the language. I did not vet this paragraph in advance. This gives you a hint, of course, that the prologue is about to talk about racism. But if this were more straight nonfiction rather than creative nonfiction, what would probably happen would be, I didn't notice anyone was talking to me until they had repeated it a few times. Then the quote. What we get here from Chuy, who knows how to write, who is creative, who knows emotions, who knows the words to use to evoke emotions, is comparing this voice invading thoughts to a radio station that's out of range. That's beautifully done. It's something that I think we've all experienced. The static and the way that language sounds as you're going out of range of a radio station, and also how you don't realize someone's talking to you, but you had heard them. That I think happens to all of us. There's that example. I want to compare, so I've got a sort of a list of things to show side by side, but I didn't give myself very good notes because I thought that I would be okay on the fly, and here we are. I'm going to talk about essays. I've pulled out what I think is properly, when I say properly, I mean technically in this moment, what I think is technically a textbook. And again, I think that the author, who is fantastic, is doing something creative with this book. And I've chosen this book not because it's a book of essays, because it's not. I think it's a textbook, but because the sections are broken down like a collection of essays would be. And then the creative essays that we're going to look at are from, or the creative essay collection we're going to look at is from Trick Mirror by Gina Tolentino. I had a hard time choosing a book of essays. It's where my heart lives. And I just wanted to have something I haven't already had on 100 times, but I think I have used this book as a reference a few times. So again, I'm just going to go to the first page of each book and read a moment. The first one is, there we go. Oh man, this is such a horrible example. No, this book is absolutely creatively done. Okay. My apologies. We're still using it. I'm just not using the intro. Afrofuturism by Ytasha Womack is the book on Afrofuturism. Highly recommend it. I believe Ytasha uses she, her pronouns. Yeah, in the bio anyway. She's a genius. We follow her on Instagram because she's a genius. We being the Midwest Writing Center. I also do personally. And she's sort of also just on the cutting edge of what's happening in Afrofuturism, which is a genre to watch if you ask me. So we're going to go to the section titled, What is Afrofuturism? And again, just going to read a paragraph. Afrofuturism is an intersection of imagination, technology, the future, and liberation. Quote, I generally define Afrofuturism as a way of imagining possible futures through Black cultural lens, says Ingrid LaFleur, an art curator and Afrofuturist. LaFleur presented for the independently organized TEDx Fort Greene Salon in Brooklyn, New York. Quote, I see Afrofuturism as a way to engage experimentation, reimagine identities, and activate liberation, she said. Whether through literature, visual arts, music, or grassroots organizing, Afrofuturists redefine culture and notions of Blackness for today and the future. Both an artistic aesthetic and a framework for critical theory, Afrofuturism combines elements of science fiction, historical fiction, speculative fiction, fantasy, Afrocentricity, and magic realism with non-Western beliefs. In some cases, it's a total re-envisioning of the past and speculation about the future, rife with cultural critiques. So, not a lot of adjectives in there. There is a direct quote. There's no frills about how that person is quoted. It says, she said. There's no she bemoaned. There's no Afrofuturism is really cool, which it is. But this is straight nonfiction, just nonfiction. No adjective, creative editing. It's straightforwardness. On the back, it says that it would be shelved in African American sociology. This is my cat pool. So that's nonfiction, right? We're shelving probably all of these in nonfiction. But we know that this is about a topic. This is a textbook. There's no pretty language about it. In the paragraph that I read, our author is defining a term. That's it. It's objective, it's straightforward. Even when just regular nonfiction is not objective, it will use objective language. So if I've got a book on political ideology and it's trying to convince me that it's right, it's going to use objective language to explain why it's right, even though maybe a lot of it is opinions. Okay, so then a creative essay, and where does this say this would be shelved? It doesn't. I lied to you all. I can't believe it doesn't say. I would just assume nonfiction essays, because that is a section. I'm now looking at the this part of the book. We'll also give genre information, which isn't that interesting for most people. But I told you could find the info, and now I have made myself a liar. Interesting. Anyway, we're going to go to the essay, Always Be Optimizing. If you have the paperback, it's on page 63. I make marks in collections like this. They don't necessarily mean anything tangible, but I chose the first one that I had marked. It's a line, not a heart or a star. I can't tell you what that means, except that probably hearts are things that touched me emotionally, and the star, I know the star is, I think objectively, the best one in the book, but it's also very long. So Always Be Optimizing, page 63. Just going to read the first paragraph. Again, this is a creative essay. The ideal woman has always been generic. I bet you can picture the version of her that runs the show today. She's of indeterminate age, but resolutely youthful presentation. She's got glossy hair and the clean, shameless expression of a person who believes she was made to be looked at. She's often luxuriating when you see her, on remote beaches, under stars in the desert, across a carefully styled table, surrounded by beautiful possessions or photogenic friends. Showcasing herself at leisure is either the bulk of her work or an essential part of it. In this, she is not so unusual. For many people today, especially for women, packaging and broadcasting your image is a readily monetizable skill. She has a personal brand and probably a boyfriend or husband. He is the physical realization of her constant unseen audience, reaffirming her status as an interesting subject, a worthy object, and a self-generating spectacle with a viewership attached. Can you see this woman yet? She looks like an Instagram, which is to say an ordinary woman reproducing the lessons of the marketplace, which is how an ordinary woman evolves into an ideal. So this is definitely Full of adjectives, for one thing. I also don't think that adjectives are the best adjectives. Adjectives, right, we know as descriptive words, but they are also modifying the rest of the sentence or whatever nouns are involved. So sometimes verbs are better, right? It just depends on the writer and the context. But there's a lot of description, and the description is full of opinion and maybe even judgment. And that is a pretty good sign. That is a pretty good sign that it's creative. It was also really engaging, where something that is just regular old-fashioned nonfiction is not going to have that so much. Sorry, not that it's not engaging. Regular nonfiction can absolutely be engaging, but it's just not going to be as conversational. This felt like a conversation you could have with somebody super eloquent who's good at talking, but definitely like someone you know is saying this to you. Maybe even as a joke, saying, yes, look at the ideal woman I've found on Instagram. And perhaps that's how this essay came to be. Maybe Gina Tolentino was describing this hilarious influencer thing to a friend and was like, you know what, there's an essay in there. I know that happens to me and my friends sometimes, where the writers, where someone says, oh, there's an essay in there, or a story. Yeah. This is a really good book. You should read it. Both of those are really good books. The three that I have read that I've already talked about, We Heard It When We Were Young, Trick Mirror, and Afrofuturism are all phenomenal. I have not read Homeland Elegies, so I'm not going to recommend it or tell you not to read it. Okay. Next, I have something that's a lot more creative, and I've talked about it before because this book sort of turns everything I know about writing on its head, which for me, as someone who studies literature, in addition to loving it, in addition to reading it, in addition to writing it, someone who studies literature, I love a book that challenges my ideas of what literature is or can be. So I talk about this one a lot, but also, I think for someone who wants to learn about writing, it's a good one to read. Let's go to bookmark it. Night Rooms by Gina Nutt. It says it's an essay collection. I was able to interview the author once. I asked her if she thought of it as essays, and she said that she felt that that was an apt description. And I don't. Is that up to me to decide? I don't think it matters. I think that the author and I can disagree. The publisher and I can disagree. The publisher and the author can disagree. What it is I don't know, 200 pages, 170 pages, 160 pages of nonfiction that is told, hi Carter, in a very new, different, and creative way. That's what makes it creative nonfiction. I'll just turn to the first page. I was going to just go with the page that I opened to, but we're going to do the first page. I'm going to read the whole first page. Bear with me. It's not very long. I used to imagine wanting someone alive would revive them if caught right after dying. If I went after them, buoyed by reflexive hope, I might bring them back, like losing something, a bracelet, a pair of sunglasses, a plastic sandal over the side of a boat, seeing the outline dim as it sinks, flooding with instinct. Dive into the water right away, head first, to retrieve what was lost. That's the end of the first paragraph. Second paragraph. If I look at the sky at the right moment, evening and morning mirror each other. The light, the sky, the air's vague smell. A hazy line blurs the intervals, deepens my readiness to disorient myself, to lean deeper into dreams where I'm falling and feel awake. It's the end of the second paragraph. I have become acquainted with the creature feature. Life emerged from lake or sea, an isolated town, a gash in Arctic ice, ugly, ancient, miraculous, some living thing scientists have not yet discovered, some living thing scientists created or found and hid. That's the end of the third paragraph. How body horror wrecks the human form, an infection, a botched experiment, the skin newly revised, a brilliant rash, cracking dryness, molted to accommodate a larger shape, eyes bloodshot or jaundiced, blacked through by change, pupils dilated wide, irises pressing into rings too thin to see, the spine, a seam where a costume zipper may hide. So the reason I read that whole page and told you when each paragraph ended is because the first time I read this book, I didn't know the format of the book, which is to say, I don't know that any of those paragraphs had anything to do with each other. What really happens in this book is a narrative, a collection takes shape throughout the book, but they are broken apart. I would say probably by paragraphs, sometimes by a few paragraphs at a time. And there is a thread that threads them together. There are references that thread them together, but the two paragraphs next to each other don't necessarily interact with each other until you zoom out. And that's, well, I asked her about it. I interviewed her, and she said that she did that trick that people do so often, and she literally cut up the manuscript and reordered it. So it makes sense. But I'm also very curious as to what it looked like first. I think I would like it less. I think I would be less challenged by it if I saw it in its original form. But it would be interesting to see side by side, at the very least. Okay. So last up, I have a proper, I need to stop saying proper. I have a proper textbook, which knowing the author, he's been on the show before, can say I'm certain creativity went into it. But the nature of the beast is it's a textbook. So it's Shakespeare's Political Imagination by Philip Goldfarb Styrt. We talked about the book with him, but I hadn't yet read it. I still haven't read it because it is a textbook. By which I mean, it's not the easiest thing in the world to read. I don't have all the background information. It would probably be really fun to have a professor, an instructor, read this book with me. I am that kind of nerd. But on my own, it's going to take me a minute. So I haven't sat down with it yet. I have read the first section, and I know Philip's a good writer. I know that there's creativity involved, and especially the thing about plain nonfiction, ordinary nonfiction, is that being able to put all this information together, being able to structure it as a book, being able to make it compelling as bare facts is a creative endeavor. So part one, the British past, medieval England and Scotland. We're going to read first paragraph. King John, the Magna Carta, and the medieval English monastery. Just one paragraph for you. Let us begin with a play set in the country most familiar to Shakespeare's audience, their own. But while King John takes place in England, the almost 400 years between John and Elizabeth I meant that the political structure of the England of the play differed significantly from that of Shakespeare's own time. This difference would have been highly visible to early modern English, and it deserves consideration in our own interpretation and staging of the play. So it seems kind of dry. But the thing about this book is it's specifically connecting Shakespeare's politics, his personal beliefs, his ideals, and his political environment in which he's writing and producing these plays, putting them in context, and then showing them to us. And to do that, you got to give us a lot of information, because I don't have any of the information. I have only the plays that I've read. I don't know Shakespeare's personal background. I don't know, a lot of people argue that there is no Shakespeare. So a lot of information that I need to understand the context of this book. So he has to give me all of that information in order for me to understand. And I think that also takes out a lot of the fancy. Of course, Philip is a scholar. This is what he does. He writes scholarly works, and those are drier because they're meant to be observed objectively. Yeah, it's a lot of work. It takes some of the fancy out because you don't get to play. Philip is also a poet. He writes sonnets. I was like, those one kind of poems, sonnets. And he writes formulaic poetry, and it's really cool because a lot of people who do write formulaic poetry play really, I was going to say play hard. They do a lot of play. They do a lot of, I'm trying to think of a word that isn't play, but that is what's happening. They tinker with words within the structure they're given. And that allows for tons of creativity if you know how to do it. So we know, right? We know that these nonfiction writers who are writing textbooks, I've got 2 textbooks here, yeah, are able to do creative work, but this work isn't that. We're running out of time. I thought that this would be so short. So we've got some examples. Again, I recommend each of these authors. I'll have to write them in the comments, but my mouse is not connected to my computer. Let's go see if anyone was hanging out with me. No, no one is hanging out with me. When is this useful? When do we want to use creative nonfiction? Assuming that you're not a scholar, you're not a journalist, you're not someone whose job is to document. If you want to tell true stories, you're probably going to be writing creative nonfiction. I brought up the epistolary because it's my favorite form. I consider the letters that I write to be lyric essays. And the difference between a lyric essay and an essay is the way I play with language. I personally am heavily informed by poetry. And so I use a lot of the tools that poets use, but I use them in prose. That's what takes my essays from being essays to being creative nonfiction. We'll talk about, the tools poets use, the tools prose writers use later. Some other video, probably already have. Because that's different. That's a different topic entirely. We're now discussing when you're going to use creative nonfiction and why. For me, it comes more naturally. True stories are everywhere. I like fiction. I write fiction, but I often find myself thinking I'm writing fiction, and then it turns out to be like definitely just something that happened to me. And I wouldn't want to call that nonfiction. I wouldn't want to write a memoir. Maybe I'll change my mind about that, but it's just not something that I specifically want to do. And so the way you change that is by, well, you can either fictionalize it and then you'll call it fiction. But it's by adding that subjective language. It's by adding adjectives. It's by using first person, right? By putting yourself in your body in that moment, saying, my blood was rushing, my palms were sweaty, whatever it is that makes you go from X happened at Y location and lasted for 7 minutes. This is just me saying things that could be facts. It's by adding details. It's by adding emotions. It's by adding adjectives or things that function as adjectives. It's gonna be also useful if you don't know all the facts about something and you want to talk about it anyway. Like opinion pieces, right? Or like opinion pieces, you care a lot about something and you're just not going to be able to be objective about it. So you really go all out with saying all of the reasons that you feel what you feel. if you want to tell a story and you're not sure how, I think a lot of the times, this is a me thing again, it's easiest to tell it the way that feels truest. So we're telling a true story, and this is an emotional story. That's all you need. You can do whatever needs to be done in editing, but if there's a story you need to tell and it's from an honest, true place or your own personal history, it's more likely that it's going to be creative nonfiction than really anything else. That's just, it's just the way it goes. We're not all scholars and journalists. The language familiar to most of us is the language with which we speak. I would say it would not at all be wrong to, I'm going to do this probably October and November. I'm going to talk about memes as language. I'm super pumped about it. I'm reading a book about it right now, and I think that we all need to have this conversation. But I would think that we could tell a true story using just memes, or using just receipts. And that's something cool too about the hybrid form, is that you can use multimedia to tell a true story without well, it's creative. When I say without, I mean with, really. I was going to say, without being all facts, all figures, flourish free, fact first approach. If you use mixed media, it's immediately creative, unless you're saying, here's exhibit R of, 26 exhibits, and this is evidence. That's different. But if I'm telling a story that is a true story, and this has been done, hybrid form nonfiction exists, and I throw in a receipt or a grocery list, still nonfiction. It's just different. Another time when it's useful, and this is the other one that I think is going to be the most common to use creative nonfiction, is when you have a true story to tell, but nonfiction is just not something you're comfortable with or used to. So then you can still tell this story in whatever format comes naturally from you. Poetry, fiction, epistolary, right? Maybe you are more comfortable writing a diary entry, and so that's your starting out point, but you're writing it, a little more cleaned up. Yeah, that's what I've got for you there. I thought that I might have like a graceful way to end that, but no, we're just going to end it there. If you have any questions, of course, let me know. If you want some clarification, I know that I'm not the most eloquent speaker in the world. That's why I keep notes. That's why I write. But I really, really enjoy creative nonfiction. I'm really happy that it has sort of blown up in the last few years. I know that when I started writing as an adult, it wasn't really a thing. And I say that because I say that with a grain of salt, because I've already said it has always existed, but the genre wasn't getting attention. There wasn't a place on the shelves for it. And it was what I was writing, but a lot of the time I needed to call it fiction, or what happened more often was I kind of shrugged about it. I've also done a little bit of like speculative writing, which is not speculative fiction, which usually means sci-fi. Sometimes means fantasy. But like, I don't know, kind of like the real life version of fan fiction, where it's like, what if this thing happened? Maybe that is sci-fi. Maybe I write sci-fi. There's not really any science involved though. And I think technically that sort of thing is creative nonfiction. I am imagining a reality. Maybe technically is the wrong word. When you do something like that, right? When you speculate on what could be, that's going to be fiction. But you're writing it from the perspective of nonfiction. And I think that can be a useful perspective, at least in the writing process. Figure out later what genre it falls under, or how to edit it, or how to make it what you want it to be. Just write. That's That's the point at the end of the day. First thing we need to do is write. Okay. So what's up at the Midwest Writing Center? Today is September 8th. I will see you again September 13th. We're going to talk about the submission process. That's something that writers always, especially starting out or unpublished writers, want to know how to go about submitting. You're going to have some homework for that one, especially if you're watching now and you're like, oh, I want to be prepared for next time. Pick out either some of your favorite magazines. If you don't have any favorite publications, that's okay. That'll be part of the process, or pick out a work of yours that you think is publication ready. That's the homework if you are going to do homework in advance of the next session. Otherwise, I'll give you homework then. What else? Okay, then on the 14th, next Wednesday, we're having a celebration of life for Rochelle Murray at the Butterworth Center in Moline. So Rochelle Murray was instrumental in the creation and maintenance of the Midwest Writing Center. She's the reason we have the Children's Literature Fest as it is today. And in fact, we recently renamed our children's festival the Rochelle Murray Children's Lit Fest. She was a Davenport librarian for longer than I've been alive, and a children's librarian, and has just this amazing far-reaching impact on our community. I didn't know her well, but my life was changed by her, both because of her work at the library that I went to growing up and because of her work at the Writing Center. I know that anyone who's been touched at all by either the Davenport Public Library or children's literature in the Quad Cities or the Midwest Writing Center has her to thank in large part. So what we're going to be doing at the celebration of life, there's going to be some food, we're going to tell stories, we're going to party. Sue Collins, who's organizing it and is a board member at the Midwest Writing Center, and was a good friend of Rochelle's, has told me she liked to party. She gave herself a week to celebrate her birthday every time her birthday came around, and so we're going to party in her honor. We're going to talk, and we're going to love each other, and we're going to have some food, but we're going to party. That's going to be at the Butterworth Center, September 14th. That's next Wednesday at 4 p.m. till 6 p.m. It's not a crazy party, celebration of life. Then for anyone interested, I'm just going to say this, it's not a Midwest Writing Center event, but last year, 2021, we had Joe Mino as our fiction instructor, who's one of our fiction instructors at the Collins Writers Conference. He's going to be in Iowa City at Prairie Lights. I'm really excited to see him, find out what his new book is. This is not an official endorsement. It's just on my calendar and I'm excited. And if you went to the conference, then you know how cool he is. Next Saturday, September 17th, the QC Rock Academy is having a youth arts showcase at Schwiebert Park in Rock Island. That's right on the river, and it's going to be really cool. As we all know, youth artists are both underrated and like concentrated talent, so it's going to be really, really wonderful. But also we're going to have our young emerging writers, some of them have a reading at 7 p.m. at the youth arts showcase, so youth arts festival. So it's going to be really wonderful, and I hope to see you there. Going through my calendar, September 21st, that's a Wednesday at 6 p.m. at the Rock Island Public Library in the community room. We are back to doing in person, first time since 2019, banned books reading. What this is just some literary experts, awesome writers in the community are going to be reading from their favorite banned books. Sometimes we have some experts on censorship come in and talk to us about how censorship is real now and what we can do to combat it. But also it's a celebration of books and sort of a middle finger to folks who wish to take books away from us. It'll be really fun. It's always really fun. It's always sort of surprising because we're seeing people read other people's work to us, but it's energizing, it's invigorating, it makes you excited about the books that you love and the way that they've impacted you. So see you there. We're gonna have well, I'll release the list of readers and you can see how cool the people coming are and how much you care about the wonderful work that they're going to be bringing to us. On the 24th, that is a Saturday, from 2 to 4 p.m., we have a reading from These Interesting Times, our anthology of 2020. That will be at the Carpelli's Manuscript Museum and Library in Rock Island. That's going to be cool. It's going to be all readers who we haven't featured before at events, and it's just a gorgeous, gorgeous venue. And the Carpelli's Museum is one of, there's a string of Carpelli's manuscript libraries. And they are the world's largest private owner of original manuscripts from like important events in history. So just a really cool place if you haven't been there. Anyway, here's an opportunity to go. And then on September 26th, we have another anthology reading at the Bettendorf Public Library. That's at 7 p.m., 7 to 8 p.m. That'll be featuring Joe Chambers and Jonathan Turner. Neither of whom have been featured yet at their own anthology event, both of whom have beautiful pieces in These Interesting Times. And we haven't been to the Bettendorf Library since 2019 as the Writing Center. I've been there. So it'll just be like a really nice event. It'll be nice to go back there. It'll be nice to see these writers read their work. I'm going to keep going. We've got a couple of things the first week of October happening, including, I forgot to mention, Writer's Studio, the first and third Saturday of every month from 11 to 1 p.m. on Zoom with me. Super open, welcoming environment for a critique group. It's a writer's workshop for critiques. We try to give you feedback based on what it is that you're looking for feedback, and help the writer become the writer they want to be rather than fit our tastes. Then of course, October 2nd is two things. The German American Heritage Center has a poetry reading on resistance poetry, and the Lowland Block Party is from 11 to 5. That's at the labor space outside of Rostock's and Ragged Records in Rock Island. Both of those are going to be really cool. I'm going to be at both. It's going to be a busy day. But also for young poets, so Lowland Block Party has live music and readings as well. But for young poets, I think under 20, might be 21, the German American Heritage Center is looking for poetry submissions, and they're paying $100 a poem. So submit to that. They're looking for poems on resistance. You will then be invited to read if you are selected. And the submission deadline is September 20th. They have lengthened their submission window. So $100 is a lot of dollars for a poem. I don't see any reason not to try. We're also, the Midwest Writing Center is looking for workshop submission or workshop pitches. If you're interested in teaching your favorite aspect of craft, then that's your opportunity. All the information is on our socials, but you'll email your pitch to mwc@midwestwritingcenter.org. We want to know, short description of the workshop. Is it a one-time workshop for blank amount of hours, or is it multiple sessions over X amount of time? For example, are we meeting every Wednesday for an hour for a month? How much it would cost? Traditionally, MWC splits fees 50-50 with the instructor, but that is open to negotiation. So when we ask what would it cost, that is for people who want to come register for your workshop. We're also interested in knowing a minimum and maximum number of participants that you are willing to run the workshop for, and anything else that you think might be important, virtual versus in person, stuff like that. Wow. My throat is tired of talking. I haven't done this in a long time. So I am 5 over the hour, but I have a bad history of cutting you off before you get your time to do your free write. If you're leaving because you're not interested in the free write, you got your updates, then please, as always, write more light into your life. If you want to stick with me, you want to do a little free write on creative nonfiction, then please do. I'm putting 5 minutes on the clock. I'm gonna drop my phone. I will write with you, and what we're going to be writing is creative nonfiction. So the prompt, should you wish to have it, is write the story of your 10th birthday. I don't care if you remember your 10th birthday or not. It's besides the point. This is creative nonfiction. Go. I'm in this weird position. My pen is, there you can see it, because my cat is taking up most of my desk space. Ninety seconds left. There we go. I hope the free write went well. I hope that you are able to mine your memory. I hope that you appreciate and enjoy creative nonfiction. And I hope that you go forth and write more light into your life.